been off duty for some weeks because of a surgical procedure, but she's with us today. We're glad to have you back, sister. Thank you. And now to continue our efforts to acquaint you with some of the important Benedictine saints, Sister Barbara Lynn is going to tell us about the great Saint Hildegard. Sister Barbara Lynn.
Well, good afternoon, everyone. Contrary to popular belief, Hildegard is known more for her visions than her cookies. I just thought I'd let you know that. We laughed at before the meeting. Sister Kathy and I were talking, and we said, you know, it's hard to get Grandma's recipe, but we have a recipe for Hildegard cookies that we'll share with you a little bit later. That dates all the way back to 1079. So it's been a long, long time that we've had the recipe, and we'll share it with you. Today we're going to have about a 30,000-foot view of Hildegard. I am not a scholar in Hildegard, but I certainly have read a lot about it now, and she was a wonderful saint who was able to share her vision and visions with the people of Germany. She was a wonderful person who believed in her call to share the visions she had from God. And like countless others, I'm deeply touched by the way that she experienced God and her fidelity to the life that she lived. But to understand Hildegard, we need to step back and understand the times when she lived. She lived from 1098 until 1179. She lived in the Rhineland in Germany. And at that time, Germany had just avoided the First Crusade, and they were caught in the strife between emperor and papacy. There was a constant battle going on because both said that they had the direct authority from God to act. There was the nobility, and then there were the peasants. The nobility comprised the kings, the lords, the princes, the dukes, and the barons, and they claimed all power and all wealth from Germany. There was the peasant class, who lived in abject poverty, serving the nobility. So when Hildegard lived her life, she faced those extremes. At one hand, there was the nobility. The other hand was the Pope. If the peasants would turn to the church, then they were in trouble with the emperor. If they were turned to the emperor, then they were abandoning their faith in adhering to the words of the Pope. There were other struggles, women and men, clergy and non-clergy, justice and greed. So her writings addressed those times. Her writings and her music and her visions continue to carry us and address us in our times. But if we look back to the 12th century, we need to see that it was a time of superstition and fear, a time when very few were educated. God, in their eyes, stood ready to strike you dead if you did anything wrong. It was a vengeful God that they preached. And to this, Hildegard brought her visions. Hildegard was born in a world that was racked with violence, dread, and uncertainty, both by the nobles and by the peasants. She was born the 10th child of Hildebert and Mechthild of Bermersheim. They were part of the aristocracy. And as the 10th child, she was the one that would be tithed to the church. So Hildegard was taken by her parents to an abbey in Disabad. You can see the picture of Germany here. The upper part is sort of an overview. The little bottom box shows you that Hildegard spent most of her life within about a 25-mile radius of her home. When she was taken to the Diocese of Mainz, she lived with an anchoress, a person who had enclosed herself in the monastery within the monastery of men. So there was an enclosure that sat inside the monastery. Perhaps it looks something similar to this. Can you see? Okay. Hildegard lived under the protection of the monks in the Abbey of St. Disabad. And she lived with an older woman who was actually 6 years older than she was. She was 8 when she went into the monastery. She lived the next 30 years of her life enclosed within the monastery in a small courtyard that had 2 bedrooms and an extra room where they ate and did their work. So it was quite a different life than what she was accustomed to. She went from nobility to poverty at 8 years old. Jutta, or Lady Jutta, was known for her prophetic powers. She was to be, was called intense and fierce, I can imagine. But she was intensely interested and intensely called to be a prophet. She understood the scriptures well beyond her age. She was able to recite the Psalter. Lady Jutta was a real prophet for her time. And Hildegard came into her care. As Jutta was known for her prophecy, Hildegard began to be known for her healing capacity. She had an insatiable desire to learn, although she had no formal education. She had no music lessons and no voice lessons, yet music came from her, and she composed music at that young age of 12 to 13, she began. In those times, monasteries were built as places of centers of education. They were the people who were educated at the time. They were the people that were the source of healing, of food, of blessing, and of knowledge. And the nobility would travel to the monasteries, or the abbeys, and they would travel to gain counsel or wisdom. Or if they were sinning and they were having trouble with the world that they lived in, they would come and seek reconciliation. At the same time, the peasants would travel and they would come to the monasteries seeking healing. If something was wrong, they would come and they would intercede, have a saint intercede for them. So when the monastery had helped Lady Jutta and Lady Hildegard, they were a draw for others to come to the monasteries to find the solace that they needed. The monks of the Abbey of Disabad provided a meager existence for Lady Jutta and for Hildegard. Now I'm talking about meager, bread and water type of existence that they lived on. They lived in this enclosed monastery, and there were 3 windows in the monastery, if you can imagine. 2 of them faced the courtyard, and one of them they used that would open and that would pass their food back and forth between that window from the outer monastery to the enclosure. So this was quite an existence for young women. Politically speaking, the women were an attraction for others to come. The monastery, or abbey, received many visitors to seek the advice of Lady Jutta and Hildegard. They became, if you will, a revenue source for them, for others, for the monastery. In those days, if you had a relic, if you were founded on a place where a saint existed, or if you had holy women amongst you, or holy men amongst you, people would come to seek their counsel. So Lady Jutta and Hildegard became people who were renowned for their wisdom and renowned for their healing and their service. They had the ability, if you will, to bring the abbey into a greater sense of acceptance for the people of the area. The anchoress, that's what they called Lady Jutta, taught Hildegard to pray. She taught her the Psalter. She taught her medicine and herbs and how to create healing mixtures for the others. She taught Hildegard how, in an enclosure, where they lived in the small space, your senses become alive, and you find God in nature and in ways that you might not find in a busy world. So she helped Hildegard understand her spirituality. She told her in her younger years, "You have only to ask the angels and they will come to you. They will hold you tenderly. They will have beautiful secrets God wants you to hear." So truly their spirituality was very different than that vengeful God that was perceived by most of the peasants and some of the nobility. Over the first years of their residing together, Hildegard and Lady Judah grew in their spirituality. And eventually, it took a little while, but eventually Hildegard trusted Judah enough to share her visions. It's said that Hildegard had visions as early as 6 to 8 years old. She didn't understand what they were. She didn't have the words as a child to be able to express what happened to her. But she did describe her earliest visions later in life as a light so dazzling that her soul trembled. The visions came to Hildegard in form of light. Lady Wisdom, the wisdom of God, spoke to her and stayed present with her all her life. She described her visions as the living light, by which she meant she had a direct experience of God's presence. The power of their prayer and the holiness of this woman attracted the attention of the Diocese of Mainz. The bishop there came in, and as bishops are known to do at this time, came and appointed and said that no longer could Lady Judah live as an anchorite. She would be an anchoress. She would need to become the magistrar, or the leader of a group of women who would join her in the monastery. So no longer would they let her just be the two of them or in an enclosure. They opened the monastery for new members to come. And they did come. 10 others came and joined them at the abbey. They professed their vows and they lived in community in that small enclosure. As they professed their vows, you would think that that would be the most meaningful time of Hildegard's life. But Hildegard said the turning point of her life at that time was that she shut down the visions. She said she experienced the visions, but she no longer shared them with others. It was as if it wasn't the thing to do. It was like when the new sisters came to the monastery, there were 10 new members. They were all learning what religious life was about, and there wasn't an acceptance of Hildegard to share the visions that she experienced. So she shut them down. And at that time, and from then on, until she began to express herself about the visions, she experienced illness. She had what we think, or what the scholars have said who have done the research for it, thinks that it was something similar to migraine headaches, because she just literally shut off the light of Christ that came to her and cut off sharing it with anyone else, because she felt it was an act of humility. Barbara Newman in her book said, we don't understand, we may not understand the visions of Hildegard, but we can understand the vision, the bigger vision of Hildegard by looking at her life. And today, rather than just talk about the vision of Hildegard and the visions of Hildegard, I think we need to ask ourselves, how have we shut off that voice sometimes that we hear inside? And what helps us to express ourselves? We may not have been enclosed in a sealed up room in a monastery, but all of us began our faith life by becoming aware of God in some way. Sometimes it was from our parents, sometimes our children, sometimes our families. But there are ways that we all came to recognize the voice of God within us. And so I ask you to share for a few minutes at your table. How have you found yourself shut off from that light? And how have you come to express it? So turn to your neighbors there and let's share for a moment. But you.
here, but I don't know that he did. I just heard him tell him.
Can we come back together, or do you need a minute? I know it's hard to believe that an 8-year-old could grow to be such a visionary woman, and from those beginnings, and we all come from different beginnings. But I do believe that, like Hildegard, there are times we're called to express ourselves, and other times that we cycle that, so we can live by her example and learn by her example. I want to fast forward a little bit in Hildegard's life and tell you that Hildegard was truly prophetic. Hildegard, one of the instances in her life that happened is at the time the other sisters joined the monastery, they began to dispense medicine to the pilgrims. They would feed the pilgrims that came, and they began working a bit more with the people that came into the monastery. So the monks were there and they were doing it, and the sisters were there, or the nuns were there, and they would come from the enclosure and they would assist those that came with need at the monastery. And there was one day a young person came, and the porter of the monastery came and knocked on the door and told Hildegard that there was someone here that was very hurt, and could she help them? And so they didn't know if it was a boy or a girl. They didn't know. It was just a person came in and all covered in blanket and in rags and was very abused. And it comes to find out, and as Hildegard worked with this person, it was a young girl who at that time, and the master of the castles had free reign to use and sexually assault, if you will, the young women of the castle. So this person came and she had been abused, and so she had run away from the castle, and she went to the monastery for comfort or to be healed or whatever. So she came, and Hildegard cared for her. Now this was all on the QT, because that wasn't anything that was authorized by the abbess or the abbot, and so she was caring for this young girl, and all of a sudden, there were people looking for her, and they came to the abbey looking for the girl that had been abused. And Hildegard didn't say anything. She kept her hidden, and she cared for her and tried to heal her both spiritually and physically. And it came to the awareness of the priors, I think she was called Magistra at that point, of the Magistra, that Hildegard had been hiding this girl out, and she wondered why she did it. And if you can imagine, here's Hildegard, who was 8 years old and grew up in this enclosure, and she's ministering to this person. These were the words she responded to the Magistra. She said, just a second here, I'll tell you what she said. "You forget that the wounds of the world overflow into the hospice, my lady. I bind these wounds day and night." She understood that the hurt that was in that one person represented the hurt of the world. And her vision for the world was beyond just the people she ministered to. She saw it as the whole world hurting when one person was hurting. And so she had the insight and wisdom she had at a young age was beyond her years. Lady Judah and Hildegard were both magistra and friend. They supported each other in their spiritual journey. Hildegard's visions were known by Lady Judah. She told Lady Judah about them. And Lady Judah, as she aged, and I guess at that time you didn't live very long, but as she aged, and at her deathbed, Lady Judah told Father Volmar, who was the confessor of the monastery there, that Hildegard was having these visions. And she asked Volmar to protect her as she went along. So what she did is she was reluctant to share with Volmar her visions. She was reluctant because she felt in humility that this was something happening to her that was not understood by others, and she didn't know if it was safe or if it was the proper thing to do for God, for her to share. So she had a vision when it was time to share with Volmar, and I would like to share that with you all now so that you can read it and kind of get a little glimpse of what her visions are, the call to religious life was about. So if somebody would help me give these out. Pass it to you this way. And this is the first vision that she shared with Volmar. So take a moment, if you will, and read that through. And as she was called to be a prophet in this vision, I ask you to think about your own lives for just a minute. What's it been like for you to be called to be a prophet in your life? Have you responded? Or does fear or humility or being worried about what other people would think hold you back? Or do we strive for the same faith that Hildegard had to respond to the call to speak out? having experienced this vision and this call to prophetic witness, Hildegard could no longer be silent. And so she shared with Father Vollmer this vision. And then Father Vollmer, being a monk of the abbey, went to the abbot and asked him if they should write down the visions. Should they capture the visions that she was having? Is this real? Is it okay? Can you imagine the circumstances, how he felt? Because the experience of visions was common in that time, but was this true? And the abbot said, yes, go and write the visions. If it is of God, it will be a witness to God's presence, and if not, we'll know that as it unfolds, but that the abbot himself could not hold him back. So the visions, they began to write the visions, and